This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Support for this podcast comes from CDTA, The Eagle, a Times Union podcast driven by CDTA. Hey, it's Jessica Marshall. I got another episode of The Eagle, a Times Union podcast. The 97th Academy Awards are coming up on Sunday. So it's once again that wonderful time of the year when we talk movies on The Eagle. This year, we have not 1, but 2 in-house movie buffs. I'm going to turn it over now to Times Union digital producer and Critics' Choice Association member Rick Marshall and features writer CJ Lias for their predictions on who's going to take home the golden statuette.
Well, CJ, let's get right to it. Let's get in with the biggest one of them all. I know they usually save this for last, but between us, let's start out with Best Picture. What are your thoughts?
You know, I'm not the first person, certainly, that has said this, that this year it's really hard to guess a lot of these categories, more so than any other year, and it keeps going back and forth. Even at the most recent, and I think the last pre-Oscar awards on Sunday, the SAG Awards, Conclave won. You know, it's kind of been going between that and Anora and possibly early on Amelia Perez, and I'm sure something else is in the mix there too.
I was sort of torn between what I think will win. I want Amelia Perez to win. I know there's all sorts of controversy surrounding it, but that was my favorite of the bunch. That was also the one that I thought was the most innovative and interesting of all of the films. But I feel like Anora has this late surge. Brutalist is like the classic one. Like in any other year, maybe 10, 15 years ago, Brutalist would have been a shoo-in, I feel like, because it's one of those movies that's 3 hours, intermission, you know, we have one actor sort of leading it forward. And then Conclave feels like this safe film. It's the one that's just a really well put together film. It's very efficient with what it does. It doesn't go for too long. It's just a great experience. But you know what? I don't know which one's going to end up winning it.
You know, we're doing a podcast, but we do work at a newspaper, so we have deadlines that are early, and so my picks already had to be in a couple days ago. So I went with Anora, because at that time, and I also thought of when the voting window was and what was happening in people's minds at that time.
Yes.
So I'm still going with that, but
that's the timely pick for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about moving on to Best Director?
I'm wondering if it's going to be one of those split years between picture and director. I could see The Brutalist winning Best Picture, but Sean Baker winning Best Director for Anora, but I could see the opposite as well.
Sean Baker, Anora, I think is the favorite at the moment, but I really love both Amelia Perez and Brutalist for their directors as well. I think they did some very innovative things, but again, sometimes it just comes down to what is the hottest thing right as the people are voting. And let's get on to acting categories. How about Best Actress? What are your thoughts?
Is it going to be, you know, the comeback, although she never really went anywhere, story of Demi Moore? Is it going to be Anora because she is, you know, the hot thing right now, Mikey Madison? Some people are speculating, you know, whether it's a split vote thing or whether people are saying, no, we want to avoid all that, and they're going to go with Fernanda Torres.
She's my favorite. I think, yeah, I'm not sure she's going to win it, but it's another one of those, like, who you want to win. I absolutely loved her performance. I think she carried that entire film, and the film would not have been the same without her performance. However, this brings up a good point that The one and only Oscar film I did not watch this time around was The Substance. So I can't even weigh in on this. Everyone I know says Demi Moore gave an amazing performance, and I believe them, but body horror I just can't handle. So I watched 9 out of 10 of the Oscar films. When it comes to things that The Substance may or may not win, I feel like I am sort of out of that conversation a little bit.
I think she's good. I don't know that I would pick her as the best.
Moving on to Best Actor. This is probably the only one where I feel fairly confident and fairly certain of the way they're going to go with it, but I could be entirely wrong because I feel like this has been Adrian Brody's from the start. There's been nothing I've heard that's really taken away from his performance. It was also one of those roles that Oscar Best Actor awards are made for. It's one person sort of carrying a film. It's all about them. It succeeds or fails based on them. They have to show a range. Adrian Brody did that. He's also a darling in the sort of Hollywood community. So I feel like this is one of those ones that was almost an easy pick for me, but maybe you feel differently.
No, I picked him as the probable winner, even after Timothée Chalamet had the surprise win at the SAG Awards, which, as people point out, SAG is the Screen Actors Guild, and the actor block is the largest block of the Academy voters, so they kind of give it a little extra credence. I don't think he's gotten enough pre-Oscar wins that this is not going to swing him that way, and plus the voting didn't correspond. I think Adrian Brody also weathered the AI controversy.
Yes.
About, with his accent, his AI-enhanced Hungarian accent. It didn't seem to swing anybody one way or the other, as opposed to, say, Carla Sofia Gascon's discovered tweets from long ago.
Yeah, it feels like that sank that film.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, because again, I loved it, but yes, I feel like that sank its chances. Moving on to supporting actress. This is one I get to talk about Amelia Perez again because I absolutely loved Zoe Saldana's performance in this one. It was a side of her that I hadn't seen in things before. What are your thoughts on the supporting actress nominations?
When it comes to Zoe Saldana, she's not a supporting actress in this movie. She's the lead actress in this movie.
That's the way I felt too.
It's her story. I know it's titled Amelia Perez, but it is Zoe Saldana. And in saying that, it's, I think, one of the best performances of any kind this year.
I feel similarly. It is good to hear that because I was surprised. I felt like her performance was so far ahead of everyone else in the nomination pool. It also was, is it just a weak year in that category? Or is it just that, again, she gave a Best Actress performance and a Supporting Actress nomination?
Yes. and the one other person in that category I will say, and this is not damning her or her performance at all, Isabella Rossellini for Conclave. I don't feel she should be there. It's a small, negligible role, and I know there have been Judi Dench in Shakespeare in Love, Beatrice Straight and Network have had tiny roles that they've won Best Supporting Actress Oscars for, but I just don't think there's enough to the role.
I don't think she did much in the film that was memorable, to be honest. To be frank about it, she was just a person who relayed messages to people in it, and I feel like she got the nomination because of the name, less because of the meat of the performance, and that's why I feel like it was a weak year for this, because performances that I never would have thought would get a nomination were in there.
And I go back to, she should have been nominated for Blue Velvet.
Yes.
And a movie that I did not particularly love, Death Becomes Her, I thought she was better than Meryl Streep, she was better than Goldie Hawn, better than Bruce Willis in that movie. That's another role I think she could have gotten some more praise for than Conclave.
Yeah. Well, supporting actor. What are your thoughts on this one?
Similarly, Kieran Culkin is a co-lead in A Real Pain. It's told through Jesse Eisenberg's viewpoint, but it's a back and forth between the two of them. Having said that, despite this late press about he's just playing himself, just like he did on Succession, I don't think anyone could have played that role.
No, he's wonderful at it, and to be honest, I don't think that's a disqualifier because plenty of actors and actresses out there are just playing themselves. They get cast to play an accentuated version of the way they normally act, the way they are, and I think that shouldn't be a disqualifier for him. And I agree, Kieran Culkin is going to run away with this one. It's a co-lead, like you said. I do wish that there was some appreciation. If he wasn't in it for Guy Pearce or Edward Norton, I actually loved their performances in their respective films. Guy Pearce was great in Brutalist, and Edward Norton was surprisingly good as Seeger. I really kind of liked his role in the film, and it warmed my heart in it more than I expected it to.
And we kind of claim Pete Seeger here.
Yes.
He's a little downstate, but we kind of claim him in the capital region. So there's that sentimental feeling of, yeah, let's give it to Pete, even though we'd be giving it to Edward.
Now that we've sort of worked our way through all of the main categories, are there some other categories that you feel strongly about?
Well, one theme I think this year, and it may have something to do with the changes in voting over the years, and now the preferential ballots and all that kind of stuff, how we're starting to see more things like, for instance, all of the nominations for Substance. Body Horror is getting in there. Nosferatu got nominations. Both Dune movies, fantasy and science fiction, have gotten Best Picture nominations. This is a good thing, that it's opening up to genres and things like that. I don't know how many of them are going to win yet, Demi Moore notwithstanding, but it's a good trend that we don't have, just like you say, The Brutalist or Conclave are the perfect kind of pictures that they used to nominate.
I also feel like this is an interesting year for cinematography. The Brutalist is probably the odds-on favorite there, but I really was impressed by Nickel Boys, and I hope it gets some attention in whether it's editing, whether it's in any of the other categories. I really liked that first-person perspective. Sometimes it was a little clunky, but ambitious and well executed, and they used it in the right ways where you see everything from the person's point of view, and then sometimes it'll switch to the other main character. And I really liked the way they used that perspective in the film. I hope that it gets some sort of recognition for just trying it that way.
And I think the ultimate award it's going to get is the director is going to do some great things in the future, and he's going to get hired to do some big movies now.
Well, the other category I just feel compelled to say something about is probably one of my favorites, the Best Animated Feature category. I love, and Flow is an amazing film that I can't say enough good things about. It is a Latvian animated feature, no dialogue. It is about a cat in a sort of post-human world who gets sort of caught up on this adventure when the tides begin to rise, and it's done in this very beautiful, emotional way that really draws you into it. It uses real animal sounds for all of the sounds, the capybara and the cat and all the different creatures, the dogs that sort of get brought into this journey throughout the course of the film. It's beautiful. I had me almost crying at different points. You get wrapped up in the tension of it, and it was this tiny, small movie that is up against, Inside Out 2 and The Wild Robot and these massive tentpole animated features. And I really hope it surprises everyone and wins that category, because it was one of my favorite films of the year.
I'll admit I have not seen it yet. It has been picking up an award here or there, and the Latvian director is giving charming acceptance speeches when he wins. And I see a little acceleration in that kind of thing for Flow. I actually really loved The Wild Robot. It's actually one of my favorite movies of the year, not just animated. But again, I had not seen all the nominees in this category. I just thought it did some different and left turn things for such a, like you say, a big budget Hollywood blockbuster animated movie. It took some chances, I thought.
CJ, this has been wonderful to talk movies with you. I am looking forward to reading about all of your other picks. Thanks again for chatting with me.
Well, I appreciate you chatting with me. This has been good. It's nice to have a back and forth after doing this by myself for the past few years.
Head over to timesunion.com for CJ's predictions. Will he go 5 for 5 in the top categories? We shall see. We are going to take a short break right now, but when we come back, we're going to dive into the strange and complex tale of the Zizians and how the cult-like group from California is connected to the death of a U.S. Border Patrol officer in Vermont.
Why is healthcare so expensive? what's happening with climate change, and are elections safe? You can find answers to those questions and a lot more with Capitol Confidential from me, Dan Clark. I give you the latest news and analysis from the state capitol and beyond. Sign up now at capitolconfidential.com. That's Capitol with an O, confidential.com.
Schoharie County Sheriff's Office and New York State Police Patrols responded to a motor vehicle crash at the intersection of State Route 30 and State Route 30A in the town of Schoharie.
The limo crash that killed 20 people in upstate New York on October 6, 2018 is one of the deadliest ground transportation disasters in U.S. history.
Things should have never been on the road to begin with.
How the hell did this happen?
The owner of the limousine company was a former FBI informant.
Well, this was certainly one of the most egregious cases of intentional disregard for human life.
It's a story of tragedy and loss, of negligence and consequence. But more than anything else, it's a story of catastrophic failure.
We just want the truth to come out.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times-Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times-Union subscriber today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Eagle, a Times-Union podcast. I'm Jessica Marshall. Well, there's no simple way to introduce the story we're about to discuss, so let's just start in 2019. For that, I reached out to a colleague at our sister newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle. Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Matthias Gaffney.
I just so happened to cover this bizarre protest that 4 of the Zizian members did in Sonoma County, and it was to protest what they felt was issues going on in these 2 groups of rationalists.
Rationalists, in this case, are a niche community that started in Berkeley, California. Their main thing is that they don't trust artificial intelligence. They believe that if AI is left unchecked, it'll basically spell doom for humanity.
So they focus a lot of their discussions on safeguarding, putting guardrails on artificial intelligence. But it's also a way of thinking. They try to take emotion out of it, and it's all based off of logic and facts.
Maybe I've watched too many movies, but it kind of reminds me of The Terminator. Anyway, the Zizians Matthias mentions are a fringe group of rationalists. They take a somewhat extreme view.
They felt like the mainstream rationalist community had lost its way. They felt like it needed to go in a different direction. They also, one major facet was they were vegan. And it has, obviously has to do with animal welfare and that, but it also has to do with the fact that they believe that when artificial intelligence becomes so powerful that they overpower humanity, they feel like we should be treating people who are lesser sentient beings like animals the way that we want to be treated eventually when AI takes over. So AI is not killing us and eating us like we would do animals. So they feel like if you're going to stick to these principles, you have to not eat meat.
That's a lot to process right there. So back to what Matthias first mentioned about the protest that he covered in 2019. 4 members of this fringe Zizian group showed up at a rationalist gathering in Northern California that November.
It was a very kind of strange performance protest where they were all dressed in black robes and Guy Fawkes masks, and they blocked the entrance and exits to this campground, and it freaked out a lot of people out. And they wound up getting prosecuted for it, and they wound up suing the sheriff's department over their handling when they were in custody.
Among those arrested, a transgender woman named Jack Lasota, nickname Ziz, the de facto leader of the Zizians. Ziz is 34 years old now, originally from Alaska. She'd moved to the Bay Area to work in tech.
And she is the person who has some pretty outlandish theories that she wrote on her blog. It talks about how the brain's 2 hemispheres can hold separate values and genders. She pushes for this certain type of sleep where you sleep with one eye open, one eye closed. She expresses a belief that transgender women are naturally gifted. There's a number of pretty far out takes that she splinters off from the mainstream rationalist group. And then she has people who follow her, who whether or not physically living with her, but also philosophically agree with her takes on this rationalism.
Ziz and 4 others faced charges that included conspiracy. Proceedings dragged on for 3 years. They insisted that their lawyers be vegan. The group went through lawyers like tissue paper. And then,
in 2022, the attorney for Jack Lasota tells the judge that my client has died.
The Coast Guard responded to a report that Lasota had been out sailing in the San Francisco Bay with friends and then fell overboard. Crews searched the 55-degree waters for almost a day. They never found a body. But shortly after that, an obituary appeared in Lasota's hometown paper, the Fairbanks Daily News Miner.
And then I kind of forgot about it for a number of years, and it was only until this past January when someone on social media tipped me off to the fact that these individuals were part of a group that had allegations on these acts of violence across the country. And that's when we started digging deeper.
January 2025. That's when Times Union reporter Emily Munson comes in here. Emily is our data reporter. Her beat usually involves spending months on investigative projects, sifting through data and uncovering truths buried within. She's won awards for stories about thoroughbred doping and the rampant use of restraint and seclusion in New York schools. But last month, she found herself covering a different kind of story.
My involvement reporting on this story started shortly after a U.S. Border Patrol agent named David Milland was shot in Vermont.
44-year-old David Milland was killed.
He was shot on January 20th in an incident in which he was conducting a vehicle stop of 2 people who were driving on I-91.
Those 2 people were identified as 21-year-old Teresa Jungblut and a German national named Felix Bachholt. Bachholt was also shot and killed during the incident. It turns out that the FBI had been monitoring the pair for days. Law enforcement scoured their hotel room and the blue Toyota Prius that they were driving, which was registered to Felix Bachholt. They discovered multiple laptops, tactical gear that included night vision goggles, ballistic helmets, dozens of rounds of ammo, 2-way radios, and also cell phones wrapped in aluminum foil. Normally, we don't really cover Vermont stories, but with border issues in the national spotlight, the Canadian border in our own backyard, and the Albany FBI field office investigating, the shooting death of this Border Patrol officer seemed important for us to cover. And Emily, who's based in Vermont, was the closest to the action.
When I started covering this case, we thought that this was perhaps an isolated incident, unfolding in Vermont, and that the case pretty much maybe just involved these people who are in this car.
The FBI did not release much information about Youngblood and Backholt. What we know from our reporting and that of other outlets like the Chronicle is that Youngblood is from Washington State. She studied computer science in college.
She actually was reported missing by her family in May 2024 and had cut off ties with her family and friends, people she knew, told them not to contact her, and had sort of set off.
Backholt, who, according to friends, went by the name Ophelia, was allegedly a math genius who'd worked for trading firms in New York. There was initially some confusion over whether Backholt was in the United States legally, but the FBI confirmed that Backholt's visa was current.
We had no idea how much more this story was going to grow, and that it was going to grow to encompass 4 other deaths, a number of other arrests across the country. So it's really snowballed since late January.
Where is this heading, you ask? Turns out Youngblood and Backholt had ties to the Zizians. When Matthias Gaffney heard about this border shooting in Vermont, he was already knee-deep in coverage of another incident involving the Zizians. He'd been thrust back into the story of this fringe group that's being called cult-like.
When it really resurfaced with us is there was a report of a Vallejo landlord who was stabbed to death.
The landlord was an 80-year-old man named Curtis Lind.
In November of 2022, there were a handful of Zizians who were living on Curtis Lind's trailer yard in Vallejo, and they just lived in a bunch of box trucks, cheap rent, and they eventually stopped paying rent, had a dispute, and were going to get evicted by Curtis Lind. And hours before they were going to get evicted, they told him that they had a water leak. He went over there to look at their property, and when he was looking down at this pipe, someone hit him over the head with a heavy object, and he was stabbed by 3 of them, prosecutors said, some with knives and one with a samurai sword. And he turns around, he's got a samurai sword sticking from front to back through his torso, and he pulls a gun out and shoots 3 of them, killing one of them.
The 2 survivors, Alexander Leatham and Suri Dow, were charged with the murder of the 3rd Zizian, Emma Borhanian. Curtis Lind survived the attack. But in January of this year, before he could testify against Leatham and Dow, another person with a known connection to the Zizians, Maximilian Snyder, is accused of slitting Lind's throat. Also, in November, Snyder had taken out a marriage license with Teresa Youngblood. But wait, there's more. Remember how we said Jack Lasota was dead?
For all the officials' accounts and friends and family, everyone believed that she had died. And it wasn't until years later that she is found in a hotel room when the police are doing an investigation on this double homicide in Pennsylvania, and they find Lasota hiding out there with some of her associates, and authorities realize she's actually alive.
That was 2023. Lasota was charged with misdemeanors and made bail. Then she stopped showing up for court hearings. A judge issued a warrant for her arrest. Her whereabouts between then and January of 2025? They'd been largely unknown. Back in Vermont, Emily Munson was following Teresa Youngblood's case.
Soon after Teresa Youngblood was arrested, prosecutors filed some new documents in court in order to justify detaining her in jail while her criminal case proceeded. In one of those motions, the prosecutors revealed some new evidence that they had gathered. They said that they believed Teresa Youngblood and her companion had received weapons from a person who was connected to a dual homicide in Pennsylvania.
At the same time, Matthias Gaffney was also connecting the dots of the Lind murder to these murders in Pennsylvania.
The Pennsylvania double slang is Richard and Rita Zako, and they're an elderly couple whose daughter, Michelle Zako, has affiliations to the Zizians. And Michelle Zako also, prosecutors allege, bought the handguns that were used in the Vermont shootout with the border agents.
Michelle Zako is a person of interest in her parents' murder and is believed to own property in the area of Vermont where Youngblood and Backholt were staying in the days before the border shooting. So to recap, the deaths of landlord Curtis Lind, Border Patrol Officer David Milland, and Richard and Rita Zako all have something in common. You guessed it, a connection in some way to the Zizians. But wait, there's even more.
Just over President's Day weekend in a rural part of Maryland, snowy dirt road, there's a property owner who notices 2 box trucks.
There are 3 people inside these box trucks. They were all dressed in black. They asked the property owner if they could camp on his property. Something about them was off, the property owner thought, so he called the police. When the police looked inside the box trucks, they found Jack Lasota, Michelle Zako, and a third Zizian named Daniel Blank.
They're all dressed in black. Some of them have guns on them. Some have gun ammo belts. And then there's also firearms in the box trucks. So they're picked up on a few misdemeanor charges having to do with like trespassing, and some of them fought with police when they're brought into custody and not given names and stuff like that. So somewhat minor charges. And in court, they are held without bail because they're seen as flight risks, and they bring up all this history and their connections to these other acts of violence across the country.
I might starve to death if you do not intervene.
Matthias and his team at the Chronicle obtained exclusive audio from inside the courtroom of Lasota's bail hearing on February 18th.
That's all. It's more important than whatever this hearing is.
During that initial hearing, Jack Lasota, right off the bat, starts speaking, and the judge is warning her not to interrupt, eventually gives her some leeway to talk, and she starts saying how she is going to die if she doesn't get vegan food in the jail, and this is affecting her mental health.
I haven't done anything wrong. I shouldn't be here.
She also made a statement essentially saying that she does not belong in jail and did nothing wrong. And so that was the most telling thing she said, because it was the first time we'd heard from Ziz addressing her potential criminality in any of these things that she's been accused of. And it was just the first time, frankly, hearing her voice.
So So that brings us up to the present. There are many unanswered questions, but a lot of them boil down to one larger overarching inquiry about the cult-like Zizians. What's their motive?
There's no clear motive. I mean, you can speculate somewhat. There was issues over paying rent with the Vallejo landlord. If you believe prosecutors, why would it come to ambushing this elderly man and stabbing him with knives? There's some of the philosophy that they've discussed is how there's a greater not paying rent, if that leads to the greater good, to better society, which is the ultimate aims of rationalists, then maybe that's justified, they would argue, perhaps. As far as the Vermont shooting, there's no, they were being surveilled because they were dressed suspiciously, according to a number of people in that town. And why did they open fire when they're pulled over by border agents? Are they looking for a confrontation, or are they just worried about getting caught with maybe guns they're not supposed to own? That's a big question mark. The double homicide of the elderly couple, Michelle Oseco's parents, why were they killed? There was discussions in court papers that they were talking about financial stuff before the homicide. Was it for money? Those are all the factors that we just don't know the actual answers to yet. And that may come out in court proceedings. That may come out when we talk to more sources. But right now it's unclear.
Both Matthias Gaffney and Emily Munson are continuing to follow the story. Head over to timesunion.com for the latest. That's it for this week. We will be back next week with another look inside our newsroom. The Eagle is a production of the Times-Union. It's produced and edited by myself, Jessica Marshall, with help from Erica Smith and the Times-Union digital team. Our music is Flyin' by Top Floor. Special thanks to Rick Marshall, CJ Elias, Emily Munson, and Matthias Gaffney for their contributions to this episode. Got questions or comments about the Eagle or any of our Times-Union podcasts? Email us at podcast@timesunion.com. Support for this podcast comes from CDTA, The Eagle, a Times-Union podcast driven by CDTA.